Commander Zefyak stood before the massive viewing screen in the command center on Vortania Prime. His three eyes focused on the holographic display, showing star charts of the Outer Rim territories. The scales on his reptilian face shifted from dark green to a lighter shade, indicating his mild interest in the briefing. General Korvax, the head of military operations, gestured toward a small yellow star on the display. The star system looked unremarkable compared to the dozens of conquered worlds marked in red across the galactic map. "This is your next assignment, Commander," General Korvax said in the clicking language of their species. "System designation: Sol 3. The inhabitants call themselves humans, and their planet Earth." Zefyak examined the tactical data scrolling beside the star chart. Chemical rockets for space travel, primitive nuclear weapons, metal projectile firearms. He had seen similar technology levels in at least 12 previous campaigns. Those species had all surrendered within days of witnessing Vartanian plasma weaponry. Their technology appears standard for a Level 2 civilization, Zefyak observed. "Why does this require my personal attention? Any junior commander could handle such a simple conquest." General Korvax's scales darkened to deep purple, showing his amusement. "That is exactly what makes you perfect for this mission, Commander. Your 17 successful campaigns have all followed the same pattern. Overwhelming display of force, immediate surrender, efficient occupation. This should be no different." The briefing continued with standard intelligence reports. Earth had a population of approximately 8 billion humans spread across 7 continents. Their military forces were divided into numerous nation-states that frequently fought among themselves. Most of their weapons relied on explosive chemicals and metal projectiles fired from tubes. Their most advanced vehicles moved through air using primitive jet engines. "The humans appear to have no unified government," General Korvax explained. "They wage constant wars against each other over resources, territory, and ideological differences. This internal division will make conquest even simpler than usual." Zefyak nodded his understanding. Divided species were always easier to conquer. The Vortanian Empire had learned long ago to exploit such divisions. Usually, they would contact the strongest faction and offer alliance against their enemies. Once that faction had eliminated their rivals with Vortanian support, they would find themselves completely dependent on their alien benefactors. Conversion to full imperial rule followed naturally. "What are my specific orders?" Zefyak asked. "Observe their military capabilities for 30 standard days. Document their weapons, tactics, and command structures. We want to ensure there are no surprises when the main fleet arrives." General Korvax paused, his scales shifting to confident yellow. "Though frankly, Commander, this appears to be a waste of your talents. These humans should capitulate as soon as they see our ships." Zefyak received his mission files and dismissed himself from the briefing. He walked through the gleaming corridors of the military complex toward the docking bay where his ship waited. The Dominator's Edge was a reconnaissance vessel equipped with the finest cloaking technology and sensor arrays in the Imperial fleet. Perfect for observing primitive species without being detected docked as he boarded his ship, Zefyak felt the familiar satisfaction that came with a new assignment. 17 successful campaigns had earned him considerable respect within the military hierarchy. Each conquest had followed the same efficient pattern. His forces would appear in orbit around the target world, demonstrate their technological superiority by destroying a few military installations, and broadcast surrender demands. Within days, sometimes hours, the local governments would agree to imperial rule rather than face complete annihilation. His ship's engines hummed to life as they departed Vortania Prime. Zefyak settled into his command chair and reviewed the preliminary data about humans one more time. Everything about them seemed familiar and predictable. They fought with projectile weapons that fired metal bullets. Their aircraft moved slowly through atmosphere, using chemical combustion. Their ships floated on water or crawled across land on wheels or tracks. Most amusing was their apparent inability to cooperate, even when facing external threats. The intelligence reports showed dozens of ongoing conflicts between different human factions. They seemed more interested in fighting each other than preparing for any possible alien contact. Primitive and divided, Zefyak muttered to himself. This will be over quickly. The journey to Earth's solar system took 12 days. Through hyperspace. During the trip, Zefyak studied more detailed reports about human civilization. They had only recently developed basic space travel, reaching their own moon just decades earlier. Their longest-range space missions barely reached the outer planets of their own system. They had no faster-than-light travel, no energy weapons, no defensive shields. When the Dominator's Edge emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, Zefyak activated the cloaking systems and began his approach. Earth appeared as a blue and white sphere, similar to dozens of other water-rich worlds he had observed during previous campaigns. Nothing remarkable about it at all, but he positioned his ship beyond the orbit of Earth's largest moon and began scanning the planet's surface. Immediately, his sensors detected electromagnetic communications broadcasts. The humans were apparently transmitting entertainment and information signals constantly, making it easy to monitor their activities. Zefyak spent his first day simply listening to human communications. Their languages were diverse, but his ship's translation systems quickly adapted. Most of the broadcasts seemed to be entertainment programming, news reports, and commercial advertisements. Standard civilization development patterns. However, as he monitored longer, certain patterns began to emerge that struck him as unusual. The news broadcasts frequently reported on military conflicts, but the descriptions of these conflicts puzzled him. Humans seemed to continue fighting, even when the tactical situation clearly favored one side over another. They reported instances of small units holding positions against much larger forces, sometimes for days or weeks. This made no logical sense to Zefyak. In Vortanian military doctrine, commanders were taught to minimize casualties and preserve resources. When facing overwhelming odds, tactical withdrawal was not only acceptable but encouraged. Pointless heroic stands that resulted in complete unit destruction were considered wasteful and stupid. Human news broadcasts seemed to treat such behavior as admirable. They used words like heroic, brave, and honorable to describe soldiers who chose to fight hopeless battles rather than surrender or retreat. Zefyak decided this was probably just propaganda designed to encourage military recruitment. Every species developed cultural myths about warfare. The reality would certainly be different when faced with truly overwhelming force like that, possessed by the Vortanian Empire. Still, he made careful notes about these propaganda patterns. Understanding how humans motivated their soldiers might be useful during the occupation phase. He settled back in his command chair and prepared to begin detailed military reconnaissance. In 30 days, he would have all the information needed for a quick and efficient conquest. Commander Zefyak had been observing Earth for 7 days when he decided to focus on an active military conflict. His sensors detected a battle taking place in a mountainous region where human soldiers from different nations were fighting over strategic positions. The tactical situation was perfectly clear to any trained military observer. A small group of soldiers led by Sergeant Jake Morrison was surrounded on a hilltop position. Their force consisted of only 12 humans armed with basic projectile weapons and limited ammunition. The enemy force approaching their position numbered at least 60 soldiers with superior equipment and vehicles. Zefyak studied the terrain through his ship's advanced sensors. The surrounded humans held high ground, but had no escape route. The enemy forces were advancing from 3 sides, with heavy weapons, and armored vehicles. By every logical calculation, the isolated unit should surrender immediately to preserve their lives. This will be over quickly, Zefyak said to himself as he activated his ship's recording systems. He wanted to document typical human military behavior for his report to High Command. He watched as the enemy forces positioned themselves around the base of the hill and began their assault. The human defenders returned fire from behind improvised barriers made of rocks and fallen trees. Their weapons seemed primitive compared to Vortanian plasma rifles, but they used them with surprising accuracy. What happened next confused Zefyak completely. Instead of requesting terms for surrender when the situation became hopeless, Sergeant Morrison began issuing what the humans called last stand protocols to his soldiers. Corporal Lisa Rodriguez moved through the defensive position, under enemy fire, distributing the remaining ammunition equally among all defenders. She took apart some of their explosive devices and began creating improvised bombs using techniques that seemed remarkably creative for such a primitive species. Private Danny Kim established communication with distant human artillery units and began calling for fire support. But the radio conversations Zefyak intercepted made no sense. Kim was requesting artillery strikes on his own position. This seemed like either a mistake or complete madness. Artillery command, this is Hill 77. Request fire mission on our coordinates. Kim spoke into his radio device while bullets struck the rocks around him. Hill 77, confirm you are requesting fire on your own position, came the reply. Confirmed. Enemy forces are overrunning our position. Danger close authorization. Fire for effect. Zefyak had never encountered anything like this in 17 campaigns. Species under attack always sought to preserve their own forces. They negotiated, retreated, or surrendered when faced with certain destruction. They did not deliberately call for attacks on themselves. The battle continued for hours beyond any reasonable point. When the human defenders ran low on ammunition, they began using their weapons as clubs. When those broke, they fought with knives and even bare hands. Rodriguez detonated her improvised explosives only when enemy soldiers were close enough that the blast would harm both sides equally. Morrison coordinated his soldiers' defensive fire even after being wounded 3 times. He moved constantly through their position, encouraging his people and directing their resistance. Every time the enemy forces seemed ready to overrun the hilltop, the humans found new ways to hold them back. Kim continued calling artillery strikes closer and closer to their own position. Zefyak watched in amazement as the human deliberately brought friendly fire down on himself and his companions in order to stop the enemy advance. Fragments from the explosions wounded several of the defenders, including Kim himself, but they continued fighting. The most shocking moment came when Rodriguez realized the enemy was about to break through their final defensive line. She gathered the remaining explosive devices and ran directly toward the advancing enemy soldiers. The explosion killed her instantly, but also eliminated an entire squad of attackers who were seconds away from overwhelming the position. After Rodriguez died, Morrison took her radio and continued coordinating the defense with only 7 soldiers remaining. They had almost no ammunition left and were all wounded, but they showed no signs of surrender. Kim, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, kept calling in artillery strikes that were now landing within meters of their position. Zefyak found himself leaning forward in his command chair, completely absorbed by what he was witnessing. This behavior made no tactical sense according to everything he had learned about warfare. The humans were choosing certain death over surrender, and they seemed to consider this normal. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it finally ended, only 3 of the original 12 defenders were still alive, including Morrison and Kim. The enemy force had eventually withdrawn after taking casualties they considered unacceptable for capturing a single hilltop position. As Zefyak reviewed the recordings, he tried to understand what he had observed. The humans had not achieved any strategic victory. They held a piece of ground that had no special resources or tactical value. Many of their soldiers had died for no apparent gain, yet the surviving humans and their command structure treated the battle as a success. Morrison and Kim received what humans called medals for their actions. Rodriguez was honored posthumously for her sacrifice. Other human military units studied the battle as an example of proper defensive tactics. Zefyak began accessing human historical records to see if this behavior was unusual or representative. What he found in their military archives disturbed him greatly. Humans had a long tradition of fighting hopeless battles rather than surrendering. They used phrases like death before dishonor and never give up, as if these concepts made logical sense. Most troubling was their apparent willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of abstract goals. They fought for concepts like freedom, justice, and protection of civilians. These ideas seemed to matter more to them than survival itself. After reviewing dozens of similar battles throughout human history, Zefyak began to suspect that he had encountered something unprecedented. Every other species the Vartanian Empire had conquered understood that surrender was preferable to death. Humans appeared to have fundamentally different calculations about acceptable losses. He decided to study human military culture more deeply before filing his preliminary report. Something about these creatures was very different from everything he thought he knew about warfare and conquest. Commander Zefyak spent the next 5 days accessing human digital archives through their communication networks. What he discovered in their military history records challenged everything he believed about warfare and intelligent species behavior. First historical battle he studied was something humans called Thermopylae. 300 soldiers from a place called Sparta had faced an army of hundreds of thousands. The logical response would have been immediate retreat or negotiation. Instead, the Spartans chose to fight, knowing they would all die. Zefyak read the historical accounts multiple times, thinking there must be translation errors. But the facts were clear. King Leonidas and his soldiers deliberately chose a position where they could not escape. They fought for 3 days until every single Spartan was dead. The enemy army eventually won, but they lost thousands of soldiers. Against just 300 defenders, the humans considered this a glorious victory, even though the Spartans all died. They built monuments to honor these soldiers and told their story for thousands of years. Zefyak could not understand how total annihilation could be considered success. He found similar patterns throughout human history. At a place called the Alamo, less than 200 defenders fought against thousands of attackers. They had opportunities to escape, but chose to stay and fight. All of them died, yet humans remembered them as heroes. During something called World War II, humans in the Warsaw Ghetto fought with improvised weapons against professional soldiers with tanks and aircraft. They knew they could not win, but they fought anyway because they preferred to die fighting rather than be executed quietly. Each story followed the same impossible pattern. Humans faced with overwhelming odds chose to fight rather than surrender, even when fighting meant certain death. They seemed to value abstract concepts like honor and freedom more than their own survival. But these were ancient battles. Zefyak thought perhaps modern humans had become more rational. He began studying recent conflicts and found the same behavior. Continuing into the present day, he read about Captain Ryan Torres, a pilot whose aircraft was damaged during a bombing mission. Torres could have ejected safely, but his plane was falling toward a populated area. Instead of saving himself, he stayed with the aircraft and guided it away from the civilian buildings. He died in the crash, but he saved hundreds of people. He had never met. Lieutenant Amy Carter held a strategic bridge position, alone for 6 hours after her entire unit was killed or wounded. Enemy forces needed to cross that bridge to reach a town full of civilians. Carter knew she could not stop them permanently, but she delayed their advance long enough for the civilians to evacuate. She died at her post, but the town was saved. More examples Zifyak found, the more disturbed he became. These humans regularly chose death over surrender, not just for themselves, but for people they did not know. They had concepts like duty, honor, and sacrifice that seemed to override their survival instincts. Most shocking was their willingness to die for abstract ideas. They fought wars over concepts like democracy, freedom, and human rights. These were not physical resources that could be captured or traded. They were ideas that existed only in human minds, yet humans considered them worth dying for. Zefyak studied their military training procedures and found more evidence of this strange behavior. Human soldiers took oaths promising to protect their countries and fellow citizens, even at the cost of their own lives. They practiced scenarios where they would sacrifice themselves to complete missions or save others. Other species, the Vortanian Empire, had used military service primarily as employment. Soldiers fought for pay, status, or survival, but they surrendered when resistance became futile. Humans seemed to fight for reasons that had nothing to do with personal benefit. He found records of Sergeant Kevin Wright, who ran into enemy fire 3 separate times to rescue wounded soldiers. Each trip became more dangerous as enemy forces concentrated their fire on him. Wright was killed during his 3rd rescue attempt, but he saved 2 soldiers who survived to return to their families. Colonel Patricia Hayes commanded a base that was under siege by overwhelming enemy forces. She organized the evacuation of all civilian personnel and wounded soldiers, personally ensuring that every transport aircraft departed safely. Hayes stayed until the last plane left, knowing she would not survive. The base was overrun minutes after the final evacuation, but everyone else lived because of her sacrifice. These stories repeated endlessly throughout human history. Individuals choosing death to protect others, small groups fighting hopeless battles to delay enemy advances, entire armies preferring annihilation to surrender. Zefyak began to understand that humans possessed something that made them fundamentally different from every other species he had encountered. They seemed to have an internal drive that valued certain principles more than survival itself. This realization terrified him. The Vortanian Empire's entire military strategy was based on the assumption that intelligent species would choose survival over resistance when faced with overwhelming force. Every previous conquest had followed this pattern. Superior technology led to quick surrender and efficient occupation, but humans appeared to lack this rational survival response. They might choose to fight even when fighting was hopeless. They might prefer death to conquest. They might continue resistance even after their formal military was destroyed. Zefyak ran preliminary tactical simulations using standard Vortanian conquest protocols. The results were deeply troubling. Even after major human population centers were destroyed by plasma bombardment, the simulations predicted continued resistance rather than surrender. Humans had military doctrines they called guerrilla warfare and insurgency tactics. They had detailed plans for fighting even after their organized armies were defeated. Some of their historical resistance movements had continued for decades against occupying forces. Most disturbing was their concept of mutually assured destruction. Humans had built weapons capable of destroying their entire planet rather than allow enemies to conquer it. What species would choose planetary annihilation over defeat? As Zefyak compiled these findings, he realized that conquering Earth would not follow the established pattern of previous campaigns. Humans were not rational in the way other species were rational. They made decisions based on principles rather than survival calculations. This made them unpredictable and potentially unconquerable through traditional means. The Vortanian Empire might face its first real war in centuries. Commander Zefyak activated his ship's advanced tactical computer and began running invasion simulations using standard Vortanian conquest protocols. He input all the data he had gathered about human military capabilities, population centers, and government structures. The results that appeared on his screen made his scales shift a deep purple with alarm. The first simulation followed the young Empire's standard approach. Vortanian warships would appear in Earth's orbit and destroy several major military installations with plasma bombardment. This demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority normally convinced target species to surrender immediately rather than face complete annihilation. But when Zefyak ran this scenario with human behavioral patterns, the computer predicted something unprecedented. Instead of surrendering, human governments would likely declare emergency protocols and begin mobilizing their entire population for resistance. The destruction of military bases would be seen as the beginning of war, not a reason to end it. He tried variations of the first scenario. Even after simulating the destruction of major cities like New York, London, and Tokyo, the computer showed human resistance increasing rather than decreasing. The tactical analysis indicated that humans would interpret such attacks as proof that surrender meant extinction anyway, so they might as well fight. This made no logical sense to Zefyak. When the Vortanian Empire destroyed infrastructure on other worlds, the surviving populations quickly agreed to imperial rule to prevent further damage. They understood that cooperation offered better chances of survival than resistance. Seemed to reach opposite conclusions. The more destruction they faced, the more determined they became to fight back. Their historical records showed this pattern repeatedly. Cities under siege fought harder as conditions worsened. Nations invaded by enemies rallied their populations for total war rather than negotiating surrender. Zefyak began studying human military doctrine in detail and discovered concepts that chilled him to his core. Humans had extensive plans for something they called asymmetric warfare. Even after their formal military forces were destroyed, they intended to continue fighting using civilian populations. Their resistance manuals described tactics for using improvised weapons, hiding in urban areas, and attacking supply lines. They had detailed instructions for making explosives from common household materials. They planned to turn their entire civilization into a battlefield where every human could potentially be a combatant. Most disturbing were their contingency plans for what they called scorched earth tactics. Rather than allow resources to fall into enemy hands, humans would destroy their own infrastructure. They would poison their water supplies, demolish their factories, and even destroy their food production to deny benefits to occupying forces. Zefyak found records of historical examples where humans had actually implemented these strategies. During World War II, retreating armies destroyed everything useful behind them, leaving nothing for advancing enemies. Cities under siege had burned their own buildings rather than surrender them intact. He discovered that humans had a concept called mutually assured destruction that they had applied to their own planet. During something called the Cold War, two human nations had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on Earth. Their strategy was simple. If either side launched a first strike, the other would retaliate with enough force to kill everyone. On the planet, the logic was terrifyingly simple. If conquest meant death anyway, humans would choose to take their enemies with them. They would rather destroy everything than be conquered. Zefyak ran more detailed simulations incorporating these human strategies. The results showed that conquering Earth would require a prolonged ground campaign with massive casualties. Even then, victory would be uncertain because humans might choose to destroy their own planet rather than surrender it. he began observing current human military activities more closely and found additional evidence of their dangerous mindset. He watched Staff Sergeant Kevin Wright coordinate a rescue mission in a hostile area. Wright's unit was tasked with extracting wounded soldiers from a battlefield controlled by enemy forces. The logical approach would be to wait for air support or artillery to clear the area first. Instead, Wright led his team directly into enemy fire. He made 3 separate trips to carry wounded soldiers to safety, exposing himself to increasing danger each time. During the 3rd rescue attempt, enemy forces concentrated their fire on Wright's position. He was hit multiple times, but continued carrying a wounded soldier until both reached safety. Wright died from his injuries, but the soldier he saved survived to return to his family. Zefyak watched similar scenarios play out across multiple conflict zones. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes commanded a forward base that came under surprise attack by overwhelming enemy forces. Instead of ordering immediate evacuation, Hayes organized a fighting retreat that allowed all civilian personnel and wounded soldiers to escape. Hayes coordinated the defense personally, moving between positions under enemy fire to direct her soldiers. She ensured that every transport aircraft departed safely, staying until the last plane left even though she knew the base would be overrun. Hayes died defending the evacuation, but everyone else survived because of her sacrifice. These examples convinced Zefyak that individual human courage was not exceptional, but representative of their species as a whole. They routinely chose death over survival when protecting others or defending their principles. This made them incredibly dangerous opponents for any occupying force got an army of soldiers willing to die. For abstract concepts like freedom and justice could not be defeated through traditional military means. They would fight in ways that other species considered irrational and self-destructive. They would continue resistance even when victory was impossible. Zefyak realized that the Vortanian Empire had never faced anything like humanity. Every previous conquest had been achieved through superior technology and overwhelming force. But humans might choose to fight regardless of the odds against them. The tactical computer finished its final simulation analysis. The projection showed that attempting to conquer Earth would result in a war lasting decades, with casualties exceeding any previous Imperial campaign. Even victory would leave the planet largely destroyed and its resources unusable. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zefyak faced the possibility that a species might be unconquerable, not because of superior technology or defensive capabilities, but because they were willing to pay any price to remain free. Commander Zefyak stared at his completed report for the 3rd time. 23 days of observation had produced conclusions that would shock the Imperial High Command. He had documented human military capabilities, tactical doctrines, and behavioral patterns that challenged everything the Vortanian Empire believed about conquest. His official recommendation was clear: abandon the planned invasion of Earth. The human species possessed qualities that made them unsuitable for traditional conquest methods. Any attempt to subdue them would result in catastrophic losses for Imperial forces with uncertain chances of victory. Zefyak transmitted his report through secure channels to General Korvax on Vortania Prime, and he waited for the response he knew would come. The Empire had never abandoned a conquest due to enemy resistance. Imperial leadership believed that superior technology could overcome any primitive species. The reply arrived within 6 hours. General Korvax's message was brief and dismissive. The High Command rejected Zefyak's assessment as overly cautious. They attributed his concerns to prolonged isolation and recommended psychological evaluation upon his return. More importantly, they reassigned the Earth invasion to Commander Thrakis, a younger officer known for aggressive tactics. Zefyak was ordered to remain in the Sol system as an observer during the initial assault phase, which would begin in 15 days when the main fleet arrived. Zefyak read the message twice, his scales shifting to the deep red that indicated extreme distress. The Empire was making a terrible mistake based on their assumption that all species responded to force the same way. They could not understand that humans were fundamentally different. He thought about the battles he had witnessed. Jake Morrison and his soldiers choosing death over surrender on that hilltop. Lisa Rodriguez running into enemy fire with explosives to save her comrades. Danny Kim calling artillery strikes on his own position rather than let the enemy advance. Empire would interpret human resistance as irrational behavior that could be overcome through greater application of force. They would escalate their attacks when humans refused to surrender, leading to exactly the kind of prolonged, destructive war that Zefiak's simulations had predicted. For 3 days, Zefyak remained at his post, monitoring human communications and watching their military activities. He observed routine training exercises where human soldiers practiced the same tactics he had seen in actual combat. They rehearsed scenarios where they would sacrifice themselves to protect others or complete missions. Staff Sergeant Eric Johnson led a training exercise where his unit practiced defending a position against overwhelming odds. The soldiers took turns volunteering for assignments that involved certain death in the simulation. They competed for the chance to be the one who would stay behind and hold the enemy while others escaped. Lieutenant Sarah Collins conducted evacuation drills with civilian personnel. She repeatedly emphasized that military personnel would remain until all civilians were safe, regardless of personal risk. Her soldiers accepted these orders without question, understanding that their lives were secondary to protecting non-combatants. These were not exceptional individuals performing extraordinary acts of courage. This was standard behavior that humans considered normal and proper. Every soldier Zefyak observed seemed ready to die for their duty, their comrades, or their principles. On his 27th day of observation, Zefyak made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He composed a formal resignation from Imperial military service and transmitted it to Vortania Prime. The act of resignation was almost unprecedented in Imperial culture. Military officers served until death, retirement, or dismissal for incompetence, but resignation alone would not satisfy his conscience. Zefyak had spent weeks studying human concepts of honor, duty, and moral obligation. For the first time in his life, he understood what those concepts meant. Some actions were right or wrong, regardless of personal consequences. He began composing a detailed message to human military leaders on Earth, using the translation protocols his ship had developed. He explained who he was and why he was contacting them. He warned them about the coming invasion and provided detailed technical specifications for Vortanian weapons, shields, and tactics. The message included weak points in Imperial ship designs, frequencies that could disrupt their cloaking systems, and tactical formations that had proven vulnerable in previous campaigns. Zefyak shared everything he knew that might help humanity prepare for the war he knew was coming. After transmitting the warning message on multiple human communication frequencies, Zefyak set course for Earth itself. He disabled his ships, weapon systems, and activated distress signals to indicate peaceful intentions. As his vessel entered Earth's outer atmosphere, he broadcast surrender requests on all military channels. The response came from a human air traffic controller named Captain David Brown at a facility called NORAD. Brown's voice was tense but professional as he guided Zefyak's ship to a landing site at a military base in a place called Colorado Dot. As the ship touched down on the landing pad, Zefyak felt something he had never experienced before. Despite betraying his own species and abandoning his military career, he felt satisfied with his choice. He had learned from humans that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Ground crews surrounded his ship with weapons drawn. But Zefyak detected no hostility in their communications. They were cautious but willing to listen. He activated his ship's external speakers and began broadcasting his offer of alliance and assistance. Colonel Janet Parker approached his ship personally to conduct the first contact negotiations. She listened as Zefyak explained his resignation from Imperial service and his desire to help humanity prepare for the coming invasion. Standing in his ship's airlock, looking at the humans who had gathered to meet him, Zefyak felt that he had finally understood the most important lesson any species could learn. Some things mattered more than survival, victory, or personal gain. Some causes were worth fighting for, even when success seemed impossible. He stepped out of his ship to join the defenders of Earth, knowing that he might die in the coming war, but certain that he had made the right choice. If this was to be humanity's last stand against the Empire, then it would also be his.